Hell's Angels biker took little girl from the streets. But the secret of her past will shatter him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Jack Reaper Thompson, a weathered Hells Angels biker, had lived his life by a set of rules forged in the fires of experience. He knew how to survive, how to fight, and most importantly, how to keep his distance from the world around him. For years, he had lived a life of solitude, choosing his bike, the open road, and his brothers in the club over any kind of personal connection. But tonight, as the rain poured down on the deserted streets, Jack's world was about to change. He was cruising down the highway, the roar of his Harley filling the air, when he spotted something unusual in the distance. A small, hunched figure standing by the side of the road. Most people would have driven on by, assuming it was just another lost soul. But something in the way she stood, her small frame barely visible in the downpour, caught his attention. He pulled over, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. As he got closer, he realized it was a young girl, no older than 8, drenched to the bone, shivering violently. Her clothes were torn, her eyes wide with fear, and she was clutching something to her chest, a small, worn teddy bear. "Hey kid, you alright?" Jack's voice was rough, the words gruff and direct, as they always were. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with terror. She seemed frozen, unable to respond, just staring at him as if she wasn't sure if he was a friend or foe. Jack knelt down, his massive frame towering over her. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said softly, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man who had lived a lifetime of violence. "Come on, let me help you." The girl hesitated, her fear almost palpable, but she didn't run. Slowly, she reached out her trembling hand and allowed him to guide her to his bike. "What's your name, kid?" Jack asked as he helped her onto the back of the Harley. She finally spoke, her voice small and weak. "Emily." Jack nodded, making sure she was secure before starting the engine. As the bike roared to life, Emily clung to him, her tiny arms wrapped around his waist for comfort. The rain continued to pour as they sped down the road, Jack's mind racing. He didn't know why he had stopped for this girl, why he couldn't just ride off into the night like he had done so many times before. But something about her, something in her wide, innocent eyes, made him feel as though he couldn't just leave her out here alone. As they approached his garage, Jack felt a strange sense of responsibility wash over him. He had seen violence, he had been through wars, both on the streets and in his own mind. But this was different. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he had to protect her, to take care of her. He parked the bike outside the garage and helped Emily off, his hand gentle on her shoulder. He led her inside, to a small, dimly lit room that smelled of motor oil and old leather. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He gave her a blanket, made sure she was warm, and then started a pot of coffee. As he waited for the coffee to brew, he couldn't help but wonder about Emily's story. How did a little girl end up out here in the rain, alone and scared? What was her past? But as he watched her fall asleep, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. Jack realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about her. And that, more than anything else, was what scared him. Because Jack knew that when a person's past catches up with them, it has a way of tearing everything apart. And Emily's past? It was about to do just that. The next morning, Jack woke up to the smell of stale coffee and the sound of rain tapping gently against the garage window. He hadn't slept much, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. He looked over at the small couch where Emily had fallen asleep, wrapped tightly in a blanket, her teddy bear clutched against her chest. The girl had only been in his life for a few hours, but somehow, she had already changed everything. Jack's life had always been about rules. Rules that kept him safe, rules that kept him distant. But with Emily, those rules didn't seem to matter. He couldn't just let her go. He couldn't turn her away. The rain hadn't stopped all night, and now, as the morning light filtered through the cracks in the garage door, Jack knew he couldn't put this off any longer. He needed to know what had happened to Emily, what kind of life she had come from. She wasn't just any ordinary kid. There was something about her, Something about the way she had looked at him when he found her, that told him she wasn't just another lost soul. She had a past. And that past, Jack knew, was about to catch up with both of them. Jack quietly stood up, his boots tapping lightly on the concrete floor, and walked over to the workbench. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands still trembling slightly from the night before. He couldn't remember the last time he had been so unsettled. His mind kept returning to Emily's eyes, so wide, so innocent, and yet, there was something in them that spoke of a history he couldn't even begin to understand. He knew the kid had been through hell, but what kind of hell? That was the question that gnawed at him. As the coffee warmed his hands, Jack turned and looked back at Emily. She was still sleeping soundly, but he knew it wouldn't be long before she woke up. He couldn't let her stay here forever. He had to find out where she came from, what her story was, and why she had ended up on the streets. Jack had seen his share of broken people. He had lived a life full of them. But there was something different about this girl. Emily wasn't just another victim of the world. There was strength in her, something Jack couldn't quite place. He had learned, over the years, to recognize that strength in people. And it terrified him, because it meant that this wasn't going to be easy. The door to the garage creaked open, and Jack's attention snapped to the sound. Emily was awake, standing in the doorway, her hair a tangled mess from sleep. She looked hesitant, as though she wasn't sure if she was supposed to be there or not. Jack sighed and set down his coffee. "You're up early," he said, his voice softer than usual. Emily didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, looking at him with those big, brown eyes. Jack's heart tightened. He had seen that look before, so many times before. It was the look of someone who had been hurt, someone who had learned to hide their pain behind their silence. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emily nodded, though Jack could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She had to be scared, he thought. She had every right to be. "I don't want to bother you," Emily finally said, her voice quiet and unsure. Jack shook his head. "You're not bothering me, kid. You don't have to be scared." Emily stepped further into the garage, her small feet making little noise on the concrete floor. She stopped just short of the workbench, her gaze flickering nervously around the space. It was clear she wasn't used to being in a place like this. Everything was foreign to her. The smell of motor oil, the scattered tools, the half-finished projects. It must have felt like another world. "I'm not scared," Emily said softly, though Jack could tell she didn't believe it. Jack walked over to her and crouched down so he could look her in the eye. "Look, Emily," he said, his voice serious. "You don't have to tell me everything right now, but I need to know who did this to you. Who hurt you?" Emily flinched at the question, and for a moment, Jack thought she might shut down completely. But then, to his surprise, she spoke. "My mom," she began, her voice cracking. She left me. And my dad." Her words trailed off, and Jack could see the tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't remember him," she whispered. "I don't remember what happened to him." Jack's chest tightened, a wave of empathy washing over him. He had no idea what Emily had gone through, but he could feel the weight of her pain. He had been there, too, once. "It's okay," he said softly, reaching out and gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to remember all of it right now. Just know that you're safe here." Emily didn't respond, but Jack could see her shoulders relax slightly. He could see the tiniest bit of trust beginning to form in her eyes. That was enough for now. Jack stood up, his mind already racing with the next step. He had to find out where Emily's family was, if they were still alive, if they were even looking for her. But first, he needed to figure out who he could trust, and who might be behind this. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, but Jack knew the storm was far from over. He was about to step into a world of secrets and lies, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what he would find. But he had no choice. For Emily's sake, he had to keep moving forward. Jack spent the next few days in a quiet routine, trying to process everything that had happened. Emily remained in the garage, her presence now a constant reminder that his life was about to change. She was still fragile, but the longer she stayed with him, the more Jack could see the resilience in her eyes. She had been through so much, yet she was still standing. He admired that strength, something he had never truly seen in anyone else before. He went out for groceries, bought her some clothes, and spent his evenings fixing old bikes. Emily often watched him work, sitting on the couch, her teddy bear always by her side. She had opened up more to him, though there were still parts of her past she wasn't ready to share. Jack didn't push her. He knew what it was like to keep secrets, to bury things so deep that even the thought of them hurt. One afternoon, as Jack was working on a vintage motorcycle engine, Emily approached him with something in her hand. It was a small, worn-out photograph, folded at the edges. She hesitated for a moment before handing it to him. "This is my mom," Emily said softly. Jack took the photo from her and studied it. It was a picture of a woman, young and smiling, standing next to a man who looked much older. He had a rugged face, the kind of look that could intimidate anyone who didn't know him. But there was something about the smile in the woman's eyes that told Jack she had once been full of hope. Emily's voice broke into his thoughts. "That's the last picture I have of her. She didn't want me to remember her. But I do. I remember her scent, and I remember her singing sometimes. I remember feeling safe when she was near." Jack looked at Emily, seeing the sadness in her eyes. He could tell she was holding back, as if the pain of remembering was too much. He didn't say anything, just nodded and placed the photograph on the workbench. It wasn't much, but it was a piece of her past, a clue to the life she had lost. "You'll find her, won't you?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll find my mom?" Jack hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He wanted to say yes, that he would find her, that everything would be okay. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. There were too many questions, too many unknowns. But one thing he did know was that he couldn't leave Emily like this. He had made a promise, whether he had meant to or not, to protect her. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll do my best, Emily. But you have to trust me." She nodded, her eyes brimming with unspoken words. Jack could see that she wasn't sure if she could trust him, but he hoped that over time, that would change. That night, after Emily had gone to sleep, Jack sat alone in the garage, the rain still falling softly outside. His mind wandered to the woman in the photograph. He wondered who she was, where she had gone, and why she had left her daughter behind. But the more Jack thought about it, the more he realized that the answers might not be as important as he had once believed. What mattered now was keeping Emily safe, giving her a chance to heal, and making sure she never had to feel alone again. The next morning, Jack set out to gather information. He started by asking around town, speaking to people who might have known Emily's family. He found out very little, just fragments of rumors that didn't add up. Emily's mother had been known to keep to herself, never staying in one place for too long. It was clear that she had been running from something. But what? And who? As Jack delved deeper into the mystery, he realized that his own past might hold the key to unlocking Emily's. There were things about his time with the Hells Angels, things he had buried long ago, that could be connected to her mother's disappearance. The more he uncovered, the more tangled the story became. And in the back of his mind, a voice told him that he was getting too close to something dangerous, something he wasn't ready to face. But there was no turning back now. For Emily's sake, Jack would keep moving forward, no matter where the truth led him. The days that followed were filled with a quiet determination. Jack spent his time gathering more pieces of Emily's past, but the deeper he dug, the more complicated things became. The whispers in town were sparse, and nothing concrete ever came to the surface. He had spoken to a few of the older residents who remembered Emily's mother, but their stories didn't add up. Some said she was a drifter, others claimed she had been in trouble with the law, but nobody seemed to know where she had gone or why she had disappeared. Jack wasn't sure where to look next, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to stop until he found some answers for Emily. He couldn't let her be left in the dark any longer. Meanwhile, Emily had begun to settle into life at the garage. She still had her moments of fear and uncertainty, but she was slowly learning to trust Jack. She would sit in the corner of the garage, watching him work, offering her quiet company while he fixed old motorcycles. She seemed to take comfort in the rhythm of his work, in the steady sound of tools clanging and engines purring back to life. It was strange, Jack thought, how quickly she had become a part of his life. He had never been one to let people get close, but Emily, despite everything she had been through, had a way of worming her way into his heart. One evening, after a long day of searching for clues, Jack returned to the garage to find Emily sitting by the window, staring out into the fading light. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and there was something different in her eyes. Something Jack couldn't quite place. She had something in her hand, a small piece of paper that looked worn and folded in half. She handed it to him wordlessly, and Jack unfolded it carefully. The note was short and scrawled in shaky handwriting, but it was enough to make Jack's heart race. It was a message from Emily's mother. "Don't come looking for me. It's too dangerous. You'll be better off without me." Jack's grip on the paper tightened as his mind spun. This was it. This was the break he had been waiting for. But as he read the words over and over again, a sick feeling twisted in his gut. Who was this message really meant for? And why had Emily's mother left her with nothing but a cryptic warning? Jack turned to Emily, who was watching him closely, her face filled with an emotion he couldn't read. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low. Emily hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her sleeve. "It was hidden in the back of my teddy bear," she said softly. "I found it after you left for groceries." Jack felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He hadn't realized how much Emily had been holding on to, how much she had been carrying. He had been so focused on finding the answers. He had overlooked the fact that Emily was trying to make sense of it all, too. "I'm sorry, Emily," Jack said, his voice sincere. "I should have been more careful." Emily shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's not your fault," she whispered. "I just want to know what happened to her. I want to know why she left me." Jack didn't know how to answer that. He couldn't give her the answers she wanted, not yet. But he knew that finding her mother was the key to understanding everything, and he was going to do whatever it took to uncover the truth. The next day, Jack made a decision. He was going to go after the people who might know what had happened to Emily's mother. He wasn't going to sit around any longer, waiting for someone else to give him the answers. He was going to take control of this. He didn't tell Emily about his plans. He couldn't bear the thought of dragging her into the mess that was about to unfold. Instead, he slipped out of the garage early that morning, determined to track down every lead, no matter how small. He started by visiting the old diner on the edge of town. The place was quiet, just like it always was in the mornings, with only a few locals nursing their coffee. Jack sat at the counter and ordered a black coffee, scanning the room for anyone who might know something about Emily's mother. He recognized a few faces, people who had lived in the area for years, but no one seemed to be paying him any attention. He decided to try his luck with the waitress, a woman in her 50s who had been working at the diner for as long as Jack could remember. "You ever hear anything about a woman named Sarah?" Jack asked casually, his voice low. The waitress looked up from her coffee pot, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sarah?" she repeated, her brow furrowing. "You mean Sarah Chen?" Jack's heart skipped a beat. "That's her name," he said. The waitress paused, her expression guarded. "She was here a while back. Not for long. She was a quiet one. Didn't make much noise. Kept to herself." Jack leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What happened to her?" The waitress shrugged. "Who knows? She left town. No one knew where she went. Just packed up and disappeared one day." Jack's stomach sank. He had been hoping for more, something that would point him in the right direction. But this was the same dead end he had hit over and over again. He thanked the waitress, paid for his coffee, and left the diner. He wasn't sure where to go next, but he wasn't giving up. He couldn't. Not with Emily counting on him. Jack didn't stop looking for answers, but with each day, the weight of the search began to press on him harder. He knew he was getting closer, but the more he uncovered, the more dangerous it felt. Emily's past was tangled up with his own in ways he didn't fully understand, and he was starting to suspect that the secrets she carried were far darker than he had ever imagined. After his visit to the diner, Jack spent the next few days combing through old records and asking around. There were no new leads, just dead ends. The town had seen a lot of people come and go, and nobody remembered much about Sarah Chun, Emily's mother. But Jack wasn't ready to give up. He knew that finding Emily's mother was the key to understanding everything. The girl had suffered enough, and he wasn't about to let her down now. One night, after another long day of searching, Jack returned to the garage. Emily was already there, sitting on the couch, a sketchbook open in her lap. She had been drawing more lately, her small hand moving quickly across the pages as if trying to capture something before it slipped away. She looked up when Jack entered, and for a moment, their eyes met. Jack could see the weight of her own thoughts behind those eyes, the same questions that had been haunting him. But she didn't ask them. Instead, she just smiled, a small, tentative smile, and patted the seat next to her. Jack walked over and sat down, watching her draw. There was something calming about the way her pencil moved across the paper, as if it was the one thing in her life that still made sense. What are you drawing? Jack asked softly, not wanting to break the silence too abruptly. Emily paused, glancing up at him before turning the sketchbook around to show him. It was a picture of a house, a small one, with a porch and a big tree in the yard. There was a warmth to it, a sense of home that made Jack's heart ache. Is this where you want to be? He asked. Emily didn't answer right away. She looked at the drawing for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I just want a place where I feel safe. A place that doesn't feel like it's going to disappear. Jack nodded. He understood. You'll find it, he said, his voice firm. I'll make sure you do. Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and uncertainty. For a brief moment, Jack saw the child she still was, someone who had been through too much, but who still believed in the possibility of something better. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't. The next morning, Jack made a call. It was to an old contact, a man who had once been involved with the Hells Angels Inn. A way Jack never cared to revisit. The contact was hesitant at first, but Jack's persistence paid off. He finally learned that Sarah Chun hadn't just disappeared. She had been involved in something much bigger, something Jack hadn't even begun to comprehend. She had been running from more than just her past. She had been running from people who wanted her dead. The information hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let anyone find Emily before he did. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew that the danger was real, and it was closing in on them. Jack went to the garage to tell Emily what he had found. He couldn't keep her in the dark any longer, but he knew that the truth was going to be hard for her to hear. Emily was sitting in the same spot, drawing again. She looked up when he walked in, and there was a brief moment of peace before the weight of the situation settled between them. Emily, Jack said, his voice low, I found something. Your mom? She wasn't just running away from her past. She was trying to protect you. There are people looking for you, and they won't stop until they find you. Emily's face went pale, her hand trembling slightly as she set the sketchbook aside. What do we do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack took a deep breath. We keep moving, he said. We don't stop. We're going to get you to safety, and I won't let anyone hurt you. Emily nodded, her face set with determination. She didn't have the same kind of strength Jack had, but in that moment, she showed him more courage than he had ever expected. Jack didn't know how much time they had, but he knew that whatever was coming next, they would face it together. He had already made a promise to protect her, and he wasn't about to break it. The storm was far from over, but Jack wasn't afraid. He had something to fight for now, something worth protecting, and that made all the difference. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Jack knew they had to keep moving, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time he left the garage, he felt eyes on him, tracking his every move. He had always been good at keeping a low profile, but now, it seemed impossible. Emily was safe for the moment, but he knew the clock was ticking. Every step he took seemed to bring them closer to danger, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. One evening, as the sun began to set and the garage filled with shadows, Jack sat at the workbench, his mind racing through everything he had learned. The more he uncovered about Emily's mother, the more complicated the story became. Jack had suspected that Sarah Chun was running from something far more dangerous than just a broken past. But what he hadn't expected was to find that Sarah had been part of a much larger, more dangerous world, a world that was still hunting for her. The realization hit him hard. He had thought he was just helping a scared little girl, but now he understood that he was in way over his head. He wasn't just protecting Emily anymore. He was protecting himself, too. And the longer he stayed in one place, the more likely it was that the people searching for Sarah would find them. He couldn't let that happen. Jack knew he needed to leave, but he didn't want to scare Emily. She had been through enough already, and the last thing she needed was to feel like she was being dragged from one place to the next. He had to make a plan, and he had to do it fast. As Jack sat there, lost in thought, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Emily standing in the doorway, her small figure silhouetted against the fading light. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. You're leaving, aren't you? She asked, her voice soft but certain. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't meant to make it obvious, but he supposed Emily had known all along. She had been watching him, just as he had been watching her. I don't want to, Jack said, his voice low. But it's not safe here anymore. The people who are looking for your mom, they're not going to stop until they find her. And when they do, they'll find us too. Emily didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stood there, looking at him with that quiet, knowing expression. Finally, she spoke again. You won't leave me, will you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack felt a pang of guilt in his chest. No, Emily, I'm not going to leave you. He walked over to her, crouching down to her level. We'll figure this out. Together. Emily nodded, a small, tentative smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Together, she repeated, as if the word itself was a promise. Jack knew that promise was one he couldn't break. But as much as he wanted to reassure her, he knew the danger was real. He had to get them both out of town. They couldn't stay here any longer. The next day, Jack packed up everything he could carry. He took only the essentials, clothes, a few tools, and some cash. He didn't want to risk taking anything that could be traced back to him. Emily helped him, her small hands working quickly and efficiently, as if she knew they didn't have much time. Once they were packed, Jack made a decision. He wasn't going to take the main roads. Too many people might recognize him, and the last thing they needed was to attract attention. They would take the back roads, stay off the grid, and keep moving until they were far enough away to disappear. Jack and Emily said goodbye to the garage that had been their home for the past few weeks. It had become a place of refuge, a place where they had both started to heal, but it was time to move on. As they loaded up the motorcycle, Jack felt a strange mix of emotions. He was relieved to be leaving, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Emily climbed onto the back of the Harley, holding onto Jack as they started the engine. The road ahead was unknown, and the danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows. But for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just running anymore. He was protecting someone who mattered, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. The wind whipped through their hair as they sped down the road, the engine roaring beneath them. Jack kept his eyes on the road, his mind focused on what lay ahead. They had a long way to go, but they would make it. Jack had made a promise to Emily, and he was going to keep it, no matter what. They didn't look back as they left the town behind, the sounds of their motorcycle fading into the distance. The road ahead was long, but Jack was ready for whatever came next. He had Emily by his side, and together, they would face whatever challenges the world threw at them. The sun had barely risen when Jack and Emily hit the road again. They were well out of town by now, the landscape unfolding before them as they sped down the winding back roads. The Harley's engine roared beneath them, and for a moment, Jack allowed himself to forget the danger that still loomed. The wind in his face, the open road stretching out ahead, it was the closest he had felt to freedom in a long time. Emily was quiet behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist. He could feel her breath against his back, steady but soft, as if she were trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Jack didn't blame her. Hell, he was still trying to figure it all out himself. As they drove, Jack's mind wandered. He thought about the note Emily had found, the cryptic message from her mother. It didn't make sense. Sarah Chun had left Emily with nothing but a few scattered words, a warning to stay away. But from what? Who was she running from? And why hadn't she come back for her daughter? Jack shook his head, forcing himself to focus on the road ahead. He couldn't afford to get lost in his thoughts. Not now. The last thing he needed was to let his guard down. Emily had already been through enough. She didn't need him dragging her into his own mess. They stopped for gas a few miles later, the small town they pulled into barely more than a few buildings by the side of the road. It wasn't much, but it was safe, at least for the time being. Jack refueled the bike while Emily sat on the bench outside the gas station, her eyes scanning the area nervously. He could tell she was uneasy, though she hadn't said a word. Jack finished filling the tank, then went inside to grab a couple of bottles of water. As he came out, he saw Emily staring off into the distance, her small fingers tightly gripping her teddy bear. She was lost in thought, her face drawn with worry. He walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. You okay? Jack asked gently. Emily nodded, but he could tell she wasn't really listening. It's just, I don't understand, she said quietly. Why did she leave me? Why didn't she come back for me? Jack's heart ached at the question. He didn't have an answer. He had been asking himself the same thing since the moment he found her. But he couldn't let her see how much it hurt. He couldn't let her think he didn't have the answers. Not yet. We'll find her, Jack said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. I promise. Emily looked up at him, her eyes full of quiet hope. You really think so? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack smiled softly, ruffling her hair. I know so, he said. We're in this together, okay? Emily nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reassure Jack that they were on the right path. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they had each other. And that was all they needed. As they prepared to leave, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The small town felt too quiet, too still. He glanced around the gas station, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble. Nothing. But the feeling lingered, and Jack couldn't help but wonder if they were being followed. He started the bike and motioned for Emily to climb on. As they drove away, Jack's eyes remained on the rearview mirror, watching the road behind them. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he had to stay alert. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. The farther they got from town, the more isolated they became. The roads grew narrower, the trees pressing in on either side. Emily had fallen asleep against his back, her small body warm and relaxed against him. Jack's mind raced, his thoughts still on Sarah and the secrets she had left behind. Who had Sarah been running from? What kind of danger had she put herself and Emily into? Jack wasn't sure, but he knew they couldn't run forever. Sooner or later, the past would catch up with them. And when it did, they had to be ready. He couldn't let anything happen to Emily. Not after everything she had been through. The road stretched out before them, endless and uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, Jack didn't feel alone. He had a purpose now. He had a reason to keep fighting. And he wasn't going to stop until he found the answers they both needed. The morning sun filtered through the trees as Jack and Emily continued their journey. They had been on the road for hours, the quiet hum of the Harley the only sound between them. Emily had fallen asleep again, her small form nestled against Jack's back, her arms wrapped securely around him. Jack kept his focus on the road ahead, but his thoughts were far from it. The more he learned about Emily's mother, the more the pieces of the puzzle started to form a picture that Jack wasn't sure he was ready to see. The past wasn't just catching up to them, it was closing in fast, and Jack didn't know if they would be able to outrun it. He had spent years keeping his own past buried, keeping it locked away where no one could touch it. But now, with Emily in his life, he knew that it was only a matter of time before his own secrets started to surface. He couldn't protect her from everything, but he would try. That was all he could do. As the bike rolled down the road, Jack's mind wandered back to the night he first found Emily. He had been so sure that he was just helping a lost child, that he was doing the right thing. But now, with each passing day, he realized how much more complicated things were. They weren't just running from danger, they were running towards something. But what? Jack wasn't sure. But the fear in Emily's eyes told him they couldn't stop. Not yet. They couldn't let down their guard. The weight of responsibility on his shoulders grew heavier with each mile they covered. He was all she had now, and he wasn't sure if that was enough. The road ahead was long and uncertain. Jack didn't know where it would lead, but he knew they couldn't stay where they were. The small towns they passed through were filled with too many questions, too many people who might recognize him, might recognize Emily. They couldn't risk staying in one place too long. We need to keep moving, Jack said aloud, though there was no one to hear but himself. He needed to stay ahead, stay one step ahead of the people who were after them. Emily stirred behind him, her small voice soft as she spoke. Where are we going, Jack? Jack hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He had no real plan, no real destination in mind. He just knew they couldn't stay in the places they had been. We'll find somewhere safe, he said finally. We'll figure it out. Emily didn't respond, but Jack could feel her fingers tighten around him, a small show of trust, of hope that he would keep his promise. He couldn't let her down. They rode for hours, stopping only when they needed to. By the time the sun began to set, they were deep in the woods, far away from the towns they had passed through earlier. Jack pulled off the road, stopping by a small, secluded cabin hidden in the trees. It was run down, the windows boarded up, the roof sagging with age. But it was perfect. No one would think to look for them here. Jack helped Emily off the bike and led her inside. The cabin smelled musty and old, but there was a sense of quiet there, a sense of safety. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. As Jack unpacked their things, Emily sat down by the window, her eyes scanning the trees outside. Do you think we're safe here? She asked, her voice soft but full of uncertainty. Jack didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure, but he knew that they couldn't stay on the run forever. Eventually, they would have to face whatever was waiting for them. The truth was, Jack wasn't sure if they would ever be truly safe. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things they didn't know. But one thing was for sure, he wasn't going to let anyone hurt Emily. He couldn't. Not after everything they had been through. He looked at her, his heart swelling with a fierce protectiveness. "We're safe for now," he said, his voice steady. "And that's all we can do. Take it one step at a time." Emily nodded, a small smile crossing her face. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reassure Jack. For the first time in days, he felt a small sense of peace settle over him. They had a roof over their heads, food in their stomachs, and they were together. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. As the night wore on, Jack sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting. Emily had already gone to bed, her tired body curled up under the blanket. Jack knew that they couldn't stay in the cabin for long, but for now, it was their sanctuary. He had to keep moving forward. He had to keep Emily safe, no matter what. The fire crackled, and Jack's mind drifted back to Sarah Chun, to the woman who had left her daughter behind without a second thought. What had happened to her? Why had she disappeared? The more Jack thought about it, the more he realized that Emily's mother wasn't just a victim in this story. She had made choices, hard choices, and Jack wasn't sure if he could ever understand them. But what mattered now was Emily, and Jack was determined to make sure she would never feel abandoned, never feel alone again. He had made a promise to her, and he wasn't going to break it. The night was quiet, the world outside still and peaceful. But Jack knew better than to think it would last. The storm was far from over. And no matter how much he wanted to believe they were safe, he knew that the danger was still out there, waiting for them. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and cautious days. Jack knew they couldn't stay in the cabin forever, but for now, it was their only safe place. He spent the mornings checking their surroundings, making sure there were no signs of anyone following them, no sign of trouble closing in. Emily had started to settle, spending her time sketching and reading the few books they had managed to bring with them. She was quieter than usual, though Jack could see the wheels turning in her head, the same way his thoughts constantly circled. She had a lot of questions, ones Jack wasn't sure how to answer. The truth was, he didn't have all the answers. He was still trying to piece together the puzzle of Emily's past, and as the days passed, he realized how little he actually knew about the situation he had found himself in. But there was something else, something he couldn't ignore. The feeling that they were being watched was growing stronger. At first, it was just a nagging suspicion. Jack had always been good at keeping his head down, staying out of sight. But the more he spent time in the cabin, the more it felt like someone, or something, was watching them. He couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closer than he realized. One morning, as Jack was sitting outside, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the mist rise from the trees, Emily came to join him. She was holding her teddy bear, the one she had carried since that first night they met. She sat down beside him, her small body curled up tight, but Jack could see the hesitation in her eyes. "Jack," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going to happen to us?" Jack put down his cup and looked at her. He hadn't realized how much fear was behind her question until he saw it in her eyes. She was just a kid. She didn't deserve any of this. But this was their reality now. He had made a promise to keep her safe, and he wasn't about to break it. He just wasn't sure how to keep that promise with everything that was closing in on them. "I don't know, Emily," Jack said honestly. "But we'll keep moving forward. We'll make it through this. I promise you." Emily nodded, but Jack could see that she didn't quite believe him. He didn't blame her. He didn't always believe it himself. Later that day, Jack decided to take a walk. He needed to clear his head, get some air, and figure out what their next move should be. Emily stayed behind, still quiet, still processing everything in her own way. Jack didn't mind. She was strong, stronger than she realized. He wished he could say the same for himself. The trees stretched up around him as he walked through the woods, the sound of the wind whispering through the leaves. He thought about Sarah, about the choices she had made, the life she had lived before Emily. There were so many unanswered questions, so many pieces of the puzzle, that Jack couldn't fit together. And yet, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let Emily face it alone. He would find a way to get them both out of this mess. He had to. As Jack walked further into the woods, his mind started to race. He thought about the people looking for Sarah, the ones who had likely been hunting her for years. What were they after? What kind of danger had she been running from? And how much of it was connected to the Hells Angels? Jack hadn't thought about his past in a long time. He hadn't wanted to. But now, it felt like it was creeping back into his life, pulling him into a world he thought he had left behind. The same world that might be hunting Sarah. He didn't know how deep this went, but he was starting to realize that he might be in over his head. The crunch of a branch underfoot snapped Jack out of his thoughts. He turned quickly, scanning the area, his heart pounding in his chest. His instincts kicked in. Someone was out there. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. Jack backed away slowly, his hand reaching for the knife tucked into his jacket. His eyes darted around, but all he saw were trees, the shadows stretching long in the fading light. The feeling of being watched was stronger now. Jack wasn't sure if it was paranoia or if something was truly out there, but his gut told him it was the latter. He turned and made his way back to the cabin, his pace quickening. When he returned, Emily was sitting by the window again, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door as he stepped inside. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. Jack didn't want to scare her, but he knew they needed to leave. They couldn't stay here any longer. He walked over to her, his face serious. "We need to move," Jack said, his voice low. "Pack your things. We're leaving tonight." Emily's eyes widened in confusion. "Why? What happened?" Jack didn't want to explain it to her just yet. He didn't want to scare her even more. "Just trust me, okay? We need to go. Now." Emily nodded without question. She had learned to trust him, just as Jack had learned to trust her. They quickly packed their things, Jack's mind racing with every possible scenario. He didn't know what was out there, but he knew they couldn't stay in one place too long. As they prepared to leave, Jack grabbed the keys to the bike and started it up. The engine roared to life, and he motioned for Emily to climb on. "We're heading to the next town," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Stay close. Don't look back." Emily climbed on behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. Jack didn't look back either. He had made his decision. They were moving forward, no matter what the cost. The ride felt longer than it actually was. The road stretched ahead, winding and narrow, cutting through dense woods and small, quiet towns. The only sounds were the hum of the Harley's engine and the occasional soft breath from Emily, who had her arms wrapped around Jack's waist, her small form pressed tightly against him. Jack kept his focus on the road, his eyes scanning the surroundings, always alert, always aware that they were still being hunted. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following them, but every time he glanced over his shoulder, the road was clear. Still, the nagging thought wouldn't leave him. It had been a few hours since they had left the cabin, and Jack was beginning to feel the weight of the decision to keep moving. He wasn't sure where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stay in one place too long. The danger was closing in, and they needed to keep moving, keep ahead of whoever was after them. Emily had been quiet since they left, her head resting against his back, her mind likely full of her own thoughts, her own questions. Jack didn't want to burden her with more than she could handle. She had already been through so much. "Are we almost there?" Emily asked, her voice soft, barely above the roar of the engine. Jack looked over his shoulder and saw her wide eyes looking up at him, a hint of fear and uncertainty in them. He hadn't realized how much the constant movement, the uncertainty, was weighing on her. "Not yet," Jack replied, his voice steady. "We'll stop soon. I just want to make sure we're out of range before we settle down for the night." Emily nodded, but Jack could tell she was struggling. He hated seeing her like this, unsure and scared. He wished he could take all of it away, but he knew the reality of their situation was far from simple. They were running, and they couldn't stop. Not until they knew they were truly safe. After another hour of riding, Jack spotted a small, run-down motel on the edge of town. It was off the main road, tucked away in a quiet corner, and it looked like the kind of place that wouldn't attract attention. Jack slowed down, turning off the main highway and pulling into the parking lot. He parked the Harley behind a line of trucks, making sure they were as far out of view as possible. Emily climbed off the bike, stretching her legs as Jack walked over to the motel office. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, but it didn't look like anyone was paying much attention to them. Jack entered the office and rented a room for the night. He paid in cash, making sure not to leave a trail. As he handed over the money, the clerk barely looked up, too busy with whatever was on the television behind the counter. Jack grabbed the key and walked back to the bike. "Let's get some rest," Jack said to Emily. She didn't respond immediately, but followed him to the room, her steps slow, her head down. When they entered the room, Jack locked the door behind them and went to the small window. He peeked outside, scanning the parking lot and the road beyond, but saw nothing unusual. They were safe, for now. Emily was already sitting on the bed, her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't said much since they arrived, and Jack could see the worry on her face. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft as he sat next to her. Emily looked up, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, there was silence between them, a heavy, uncertain silence that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we'll ever be okay?" Jack's heart sank. He didn't have the answer to that question. He didn't know when, or if, they would ever be truly safe. The world they were living in now was full of uncertainty, full of people who would do anything to keep them from finding peace. But what he didn't know was that as long as he was here, he would do everything he could to protect her. "I don't know," Jack said honestly. "But I do know that as long as we're together, we'll get through this. I'll make sure of it." Emily nodded slowly, though Jack could see the doubt in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, but the fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface. Jack reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out," he said. "One step at a time." Emily didn't respond, but she leaned into him slightly, as if taking comfort in his words, even if she didn't fully believe them. Jack sat with her for a moment longer, the weight of their situation pressing on him. He couldn't protect her from everything, and he knew that. But he would try. He had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it. The night stretched on, and Jack could hear the soft sound of Emily's breathing as she drifted off to sleep beside him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if they would even make it through the night without trouble finding them. But for the first time in a while, he allowed himself to close his eyes, to rest, knowing that for now, they were safe. At least for tonight. The next morning, Jack woke up to the sound of rain tapping lightly against the motel window. He had barely slept the night before, his mind too restless, constantly returning to the fact that they were still running. Every decision he made, every move he took, felt like it was just buying them a little more time before they had to face whatever was coming. Emily was still asleep beside him, her small form curled up in the blankets. For a moment, Jack allowed himself to simply watch her, her peaceful expression in stark contrast to the world outside. It was hard to believe that this little girl, who had already been through so much, was still holding on, still fighting. Jack's heart tightened. He couldn't help but wonder how much more she could take. He had promised her that they would get through this, but each day felt more uncertain than the last. He knew that. Time was running out. They couldn't stay hidden forever. After a long, tense breakfast, Jack and Emily loaded up the bike again, preparing to leave. Jack wasn't sure where they were headed next, but he knew it couldn't be too far from here. They needed to keep moving. The farther they went, the harder it would be for anyone to catch up with them. They rode for hours, the rain still falling steadily, the roads slick and treacherous. Jack kept his focus on the road ahead, but his mind kept wandering back to Sarah, to the choices she had made, and to the dangerous world she had tried to escape. It wasn't just about Emily anymore, it was about him, too. His past, the life he had left behind, was closing in on him. He had never been the kind of man to run, to hide, but now, that was all he could do. And he couldn't help but wonder if it was too late for him to ever truly escape. When they stopped for gas in a small town, Jack's senses went on high alert. There was something off about this place. It was too quiet, too still. Jack looked around, his instincts screaming that something wasn't right. He quickly paid for the gas and motioned for Emily to get back on the bike. As they pulled out of the station, Jack kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his heart racing. The feeling of being watched was back again. The uneasy silence between them stretched on for miles until they reached a town far enough from the one they had just left behind. Jack knew they needed to take a break, to regroup, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. They checked into a small inn on the outskirts of town, one with only a few rooms, and Jack took extra care to make sure no one was watching. The clerk barely looked up when they entered, and Jack knew it would be easy for them to slip under the radar here. The room was small, but it would do. Emily went straight to the bed and sat down, her eyes distant as she stared out the window. Jack sat beside her, his thoughts racing. He didn't want to alarm her, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that they were running out of time. He needed to get ahead of whatever was coming for them. "You okay?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Emily didn't answer right away. She just stared out the window, her fingers twirling a strand of her hair. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet and uncertain. "Do you think my mom is still out there?" Jack's chest tightened. He had been dreading this moment, but he knew it was coming. He couldn't lie to her. He wasn't sure what had happened to Sarah. He didn't even know if she was alive. But he couldn't tell Emily that. She deserved more than uncertainty. "I don't know," Jack said, his voice gentle but firm. "But I promise you, Emily, we're going to find out. We're not going to stop until we get the answers you deserve." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. "You mean it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, his gaze steady. "I swear it. We'll figure this out, together." Emily smiled a little, the smallest glimmer of hope in her eyes. Jack reached over and ruffled her hair, his heart swelling with a protective love for this little girl who had become so much more than just a child in need. She had become his reason for fighting, his reason for keeping going, even when everything seemed impossible. After a long silence, Emily stood up and walked to the window, her hands pressed against the cool glass. Jack watched her, his mind turning over the same questions that had been plaguing him for days. Who was Sarah really? What had she been involved in? And most importantly, where was she now? But those questions had to wait. For now, all that mattered was Emily. As Jack went to the door to check outside one more time, he heard a car pull up outside the inn. His heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly, his senses on high alert. Someone was out there. He couldn't see them yet, but he could feel them. The silence was too thick, too heavy. The air was thick with tension. Jack motioned for Emily to stay low, to stay quiet. He wasn't sure if they had been spotted or if it was just his paranoia, but he wasn't taking any chances. The footsteps outside grew louder, but there was no sign of anyone. Jack's heart raced in his chest as he quietly moved toward the window, peering out into the darkness. The street was empty. There was no one around. But he couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closer than ever. Jack stood by the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he peered into the darkness. The street outside the motel was eerily still, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. He caught off guard. Not now. He peeked through the small peephole in the door. There was no one there. But Jack wasn't convinced. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He slowly opened the door, just a crack, his eyes scanning the empty hallway outside. Still nothing. His breath came out in a slow exhale as he opened the door wider. But before he could step out, Emily's voice interrupted him from behind. "Jack!" She was standing at the edge of the bed, looking up at him with those wide, trusting eyes. She was still groggy from sleep, but Jack could see the fear in her expression. She had heard the knock too. "What's going on?" she asked softly, her voice shaking. Jack turned back to face her, trying to mask the tension in his own voice. "It's nothing, Emily," he said as calmly as he could. "Just stay here, okay? I'll be right back." Emily hesitated, but Jack could see the fear in her eyes, and he hated it. He didn't want her to be afraid. He didn't want her to think he wasn't in control. "Jack, I'm scared," she whispered, taking a step toward him. Jack's heart broke. He had promised her safety, but right now, he wasn't sure if he could keep that promise. "You're going to be fine," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm not going anywhere, I swear." He didn't know if she believed him, but he had to get out there, figure out who had been at the door, and make sure they weren't being followed. Jack stepped out into the hallway, moving cautiously. He kept his steps light, his senses on high alert. The hallway was empty, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. As he made his way to the end of the hallway, he heard footsteps approaching from around the corner. Jack froze, pressing himself against the wall, his hand gripping the knife. The footsteps stopped, and for a brief moment, everything was silent. Jack's pulse quickened. He couldn't stay hidden forever. The person was getting closer, but there was no time to retreat. Jack made his move, stepping out just as a man appeared at the corner of the hallway. The man was tall, wearing a leather jacket and sunglasses, despite the dim light of the motel. Jack didn't recognize him. The man didn't say anything at first, just stared at Jack with a look that could freeze anyone in their tracks. Jack's grip on the knife tightened. This was it. Whatever was going on, whatever danger was looming over them, it was right here, right now. The man took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. You're the one looking for Sarah, right? Jack's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to find them so soon. I don't know what you're talking about, Jack said, his voice steady despite the fear rising inside him. You sure about that? The man said with a smirk, his voice low and dangerous. I think you do. And I think you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jack knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let this guy get any closer to Emily. The man took another step forward, and that was all Jack needed. He moved quickly, disarming the man with a swift motion that left him stunned. The man stumbled back, and Jack had him pinned against the wall in a split second. Who are you? Jack demanded, his voice sharp. The man didn't answer at first, his chest heaving with anger and disbelief. Jack wasn't about to wait around for answers. He needed to protect Emily, and he needed to do it now. He pressed harder, his knife glinting in the dim light. Tell me what I need to know, Jack growled, his patience wearing thin. Finally, the man spoke. You don't know who you're messing with, he said, his voice full of contempt. You'll find out soon enough. Jack didn't have time for this. He let go of the man, shoving him to the ground before quickly retreating back to the room. He didn't wait for the man to recover. He didn't need to. He needed to get Emily and get out, now. Jack rushed back into the room, locking the door behind him. Emily was still standing there, her eyes wide with fear, waiting for him. He could see the question in her gaze, but Jack had no answers. We have to go, he said, his voice urgent. Now. Emily didn't question him, didn't ask where they were going. She just nodded, grabbing her things. Jack didn't know where they would go next, but he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stay here any longer. Jack's heart raced as he grabbed Emily's hand and led her out of the room. The footsteps outside the door were getting louder, and he didn't want to stick around to see if they belonged to more people who might be hunting them. He didn't wait to see if they were followed. He simply knew they couldn't risk it anymore. They had to go, and they had to go now. They moved quickly through the small hallway, keeping low, as Jack glanced over his shoulder, checking for any sign that they were being watched. The parking lot was still, and the world outside was quiet. Jack kept his hand on Emily's, his mind racing through what he needed to do next. His brain was firing on all cylinders, making sure they were heading to safety, all while trying to keep Emily calm. We're almost there, Emily. Just stay close, Jack said in a low voice as they moved toward the bike. Emily nodded, but her face was pale, filled with a quiet fear. Jack could see that she didn't understand what was going on, but he didn't have time to explain it all right now. He could feel the weight of responsibility pushing down on him. He couldn't fail her, not now. Jack helped Emily onto the bike, then climbed on behind her, kicking the engine to life. He didn't bother with looking over his shoulder. He was already planning the next move, his mind going through all the possibilities. Every choice felt critical. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Jack's eyes darted around, scanning the street for any sign of pursuit. They were heading down a different road this time, away from the main highways, making their way through winding back roads where they were less likely to be seen. The rain had stopped, leaving the roads slick with remnants of the downpour. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the landscape. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars, his thoughts still whirling. We'll find somewhere to stay, Emily, Jack said, trying to reassure her. It won't be long, okay? Emily didn't answer, but he felt her body tense against him as they rode. He could only imagine how overwhelming everything must be for her. She had already lost so much, and now they were running from whatever it was that had come after her mother. But Jack wasn't going to stop. He couldn't afford to. You're safe with me, Jack added, his voice softer now, but still firm. Emily shifted slightly, her hand gripping his tightly as they sped through the countryside. I know, Jack, she said quietly, though her voice sounded uncertain. Jack didn't know if she truly believed him, but he was determined to keep that promise. They drove for miles, taking more turns than Jack could count, until they reached a small, secluded cabin hidden in the woods. Jack had been here before, a long time ago, and he knew it was a place that no one would think to look for them. It was isolated, hidden by thick trees, and far enough from town that they could blend in. The motorcycle came to a stop outside the cabin, and Jack quickly dismounted, helping Emily off the bike. She seemed more at ease now, the sense of urgency fading as they approached the cabin. This place should be safe, Jack said, his voice low. Stay close. We'll settle in here for a while. Emily nodded, following Jack inside. The cabin was small, but it had everything they needed: a bed, a small stove, and enough space for them to be out of sight. Jack immediately locked the door behind them, securing it with the old-fashioned bolt that was the only security the cabin had. "I'm going to check around," Jack said, his voice steady. "Stay inside, okay? Don't open the door for anyone." Emily nodded, her eyes wide. She wasn't used to this, Jack could tell. She wasn't used to hiding, to feeling like she had to be afraid of every shadow. Jack hated that he had to put her through this. He stepped outside for a moment, scanning the area to make sure they weren't being followed. The trees were quiet, the sky beginning to darken with the onset of night. Everything seemed calm for now, but Jack didn't let his guard down. He knew better than that. The last time he had relaxed, it had nearly cost them everything. He moved quickly around the perimeter of the cabin, checking for any signs of disturbance. When he was satisfied that there was no immediate threat, he went back inside. Emily was sitting on the bed, her teddy bear beside her, staring out the small window. She looked up when he entered, her eyes full of questions. "Jack, are we safe here?" Her voice was soft, uncertain. Jack sat down beside her, taking a deep breath. "For now," he said, looking out the window with her. "But we can't stay too long. We'll keep moving, keep ahead of whoever's after us." Emily didn't say anything, but Jack could feel the weight of her thoughts. She was still processing everything, and he couldn't blame her. She was just a kid, caught in a situation she couldn't possibly understand. Jack reached over and gently placed his hand on hers. "We'll make it through this," he said, his voice firm. "I won't let anything happen to you." Emily finally looked at him, her eyes full of uncertainty, but there was something else there, too: trust. For the first time in days, Jack allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this. Maybe they could outrun the past, outrun the danger that was always lurking behind them. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew one thing for sure. He was going to do whatever it took to protect Emily, to keep her safe. They had already lost so much, but Jack was determined not to let her lose everything again. As the night settled in, Jack made a silent promise to himself and to Emily. No matter what came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a small flicker of hope, a glimmer that maybe they could build something better from the wreckage of their lives.